Welcome to Lines and Spaces!
I'm Jason.
And I'm Michaela.
So today we're going to be talking about primarily ideas of private lessons and public school classroom lessons. Not so much of like a versus, but more just like a comparison about the roles of each play and how they may work together to produce some successful music education for students. But before we get into that, since we spent a lot of time in our last episode talking about mindfulness and just taking care of ourselves, Michaela, how have you been doing?
Jason, I've been doing well. Um, yeah, just have gotten to spend some time stepping away from my computer, occasionally giving myself breaks like that, and realizing that there's just a lot going on. How about you, Jason?
I am definitely in a very similar boat. Yeah, trying to find time, especially right now we're currently in the week before essentially like finals because we have Thanksgiving break coming up. That week is off. But then the next like 3 weeks are just essentially finals and just finishing up whatever thing. So we're kind of in like I don't know the word of what the term is called, but we're on.
Chaos.
Yeah, chaos is a great word to describe it. But a lot of things happening and a lot of projects coming up for me that need to be completed, which partially my fault for signing up and saying that I would do all these things. But can't blame the past things that I already decided that I was gonna do. But I'm definitely echoing Michaela's point. Been taking some time off of the computer whenever I can, and just laying down. I've been taking a lot of walks, which is good.
Walks are great.
I know that you do a lot of that too, as well. Especially these past few days, just being able to walk in like chilly weather. I don't know about you, Michaela, but I really enjoy autumn, like
I
just
do
the
too.
chill.
I like it.
Definitely, for anybody listening, if you just need like a break, because it is really busy for a lot of people, regardless if you're in school or in the profession or working. If you can ever find just some time, take a pause, and just get away from what is work and what is the chaos of everything going on. Definitely, take it, drive around your town or area, go on a long drive or a long walk. Maybe just sit outside and watch the sun move across the sky.
Maybe not directly watch the sun,
Yeah,
but
don't look at the sun directly.
unless you're having a really bad day and you're done.
I've always wanted to feel blindness. No, sorry, but
Today we're going to be talking about completely unrelated. We're going to be talking a little bit about private lessons versus teaching general classes or bigger classes in public schools.
yeah, we're going to be talking about more so, not so much. We're going to talk about with our experiences in both settings, and also having gone through the majority of the pre-service learning, how we feel public classroom teaching compared to private lesson settings and how they can interplay with each other, and it's not so much of a like one is better than the other or one is it's more so that like they both fulfill different goals. So I'm gonna start with you, Michaela. What is your experience, I guess, in being a private lesson student, I guess, throughout your education?
Sure, yeah. So through my time in college, I took voice lessons, one-on-one voice lessons as a requirement to my major. Um, and we focused mainly on classical music, which I had virtually no background in. Really, my only knowledge of classical music was from my high school choir director, and so in my college voice lessons, I learned a lot about technique, and it was different from everything that I had learned before college because my voice had matured, and yeah, it was really interesting to have that new perspective of classical training and kind of getting more familiar with the parts of my voice. And I also had realized there's a different type of pressure, not pressure necessarily in a bad way, but a pressure and accountability when it's a one on one lesson versus when you're attending a class or a larger rehearsal. So that brings a very interesting dynamic, I suppose, to the learning environment. But how about you, Jason?
No, I completely agree with, especially with the thing at the end there about the dynamic between student and teacher in a classroom setting and the private lesson setting. But for me, I took private lessons. I took private piano lessons for the majority of my I guess for most of my life. I started in second grade, ended freshman year of high school, took piano lessons, and those lessons were always in, for me at least, they were kind of intimidating because, like you said, you're accountable. Like you're both your parents are paying for them, and also there's nowhere to hide. It's either you practiced or you didn't, and you can't really get away with just faking it. I guess is the word. But no, I would say like with the private lessons, I think there's also I definitely had a lot more attention. Like my teacher gave me more attention on just technique building and learning music itself, which are things that I'm really thankful for because those kind of help translate me into the classroom setting where maybe I didn't get quite that much attention. Because for the most part, for my music learning in the public school, my elementary school, middle school, though they were in elementary school, they were kind of like lesson, like private lesson focused. It was still like a larger group of kids, and it wasn't always possible for the teacher to get around to everybody to make sure that they knew everything. And even in middle school, primarily just ensembles with supplementary lessons on the side, you could fake it, you could get by. Nobody you had there was accountability, but not as precedent as when you're doing the one-on-one with somebody who can hear exactly what you're playing. So that's definitely my experience with just both those settings.
Yeah,
But
definitely.
how about in like the teaching role, like being a teacher, having taught? I'm sure you've taught lessons privately and also, of course, in the larger classroom setting.
Yeah, it's definitely a different atmosphere in each. In a larger classroom, I've had a little more experience with general music than I have had with anything else. And teaching in a general music classroom is so very different from teaching in a private lesson for so many reasons. A few of these reasons would be in a general music class at a public school, not everybody that is in that class is that interested in what you have to teach, which is part of your job as a teacher to make it relevant. And additionally, in a general music class, with that large spread of different levels of interests and different levels of engagement, it's it's very very different from when you have somebody coming to you intentionally with sometimes they have certain goals in mind and sometimes they don't, but overall they have the general idea of I want to get better at blank, whatever instrument, whatever part of music. And in my very minimal experience teaching private lessons, it's interesting to it's an interesting dynamic that is so different from having a large group of people. It's one on one, so you get to build a different type of rapport. And yeah, I guess from a technical and procedural standpoint, you go about it differently in making your student comfortable enough to take musical risks and to learn than you would with a larger group where it's kind of they have that like that herd of like I guess backup or like they could kind of fall back on. And one on one, I think it's important to make sure that there's real expectations that are established and also enough understanding and, for lack of a better term, forgiveness when students come unprepared and that type of thing to be understanding and so that they could try anyway. Jason?
Yeah, so going a lot of what you said, I also echo as well. And like the difference between teaching in the private lesson and in from my experience in the classroom or larger groups is definitely your dynamics a little different. Though the same goals still apply, you should still show care and you should still communicate effectively and still respect their time and everything. But in the private lesson setting, I definitely will request that my students actually keep up at like a certain level to be at. And like this, of course, you're not always super prepared, but there's expectations in the private lessons that they're coming to you because they want to get better at X, Y, and Z. Like they want to get better at it. Whereas in the classroom setting, not everybody there could be equally as invested or interested, and you just kind of had to go with it and try your best to get those who probably aren't as interested along with you. And that's with your lesson planning, you build that in with how you prepare and how you present things. So you present things for the larger majority of students so that everybody understands, everybody can be on board with what's being taught. Whereas in the private lesson setting, I'll have a plan laid out, but it's not going to be as in depth of like, oh, here's my transition, here's this, here's the next step. It's more so um, just touching up on playing etudes, hearing them play, giving feedback on their individual playing, and going in more in depth in the technique and more, I guess, musical aspects of their own playing rather than the larger group. And they can't hide; they have to do it. Whereas in the larger classroom with everybody, you feel more comfortable sometimes presenting in the larger group as well because there's more people. And also sometimes it's difficult for students to communicate because there are more people.
Right. And actually, on that point of like having other people around you while you're learning, it is interesting how um, the people in the classes around us really do affect our and shape our learning sometimes. For example, in a choir setting, or really in any instrumental setting too, if you have a few different students who are at different levels of their, let's say, sight reading abilities, you might place somebody who struggles with sight reading near somebody who really excels in it so that they could kind of start to learn and build their, whether it's their oral skills or whatever it is that they need to work on, they could kind of have that in the environment. So it's, again, just so very different in one-on-one.
Yeah, no, and I completely agree that also that's a really great thing to mention about in the group setting you have more people. Students can rely on one another and they're not all solely accountable to just being like the best. And there's also that community aspect within the larger music classroom that normally isn't found within the private setting because you're only working with one student. And though you may have a studio, sometimes not all the students actually get to interact with one another, especially if you're you are the sole person running the studio and you don't have any like studio ensembles or anything. But yeah, no, definitely in the classroom you can build. It's a lot easier to build community and build like camaraderie amongst students that they want to, and they can also senior students or upperclassmen can get younger students into the classroom and feel comfortable there. Whereas in the private setting, you're the only one responsible with getting those students on board with you, which is in of itself could also be a good thing and a bad thing at the same time, depending on the relationship that you have with the student. But yeah, I mean
So,
that's
I have a question for you.
yes.
How would you go about generally planning a private lesson differently from how you would go about planning for a lesson with a larger class?
Well, largely it depends on, of course, like the setting that I'm in, like what I'm actually teaching, whether it's instrumental, choral, or strings. But primarily in a private lesson setting, I'll primarily just be asking them, hey, can you play said etude, and just hear them play it all the way. This is of a student, of course, that I probably been working longer with and had more one-on-one interaction. So we have a pretty the student teacher dynamic is more comfortable, and there's a lot of communication going back and forth. Hopefully, I would definitely just my lesson plan for that setting would just be this is what they did last week. This is what something that's new that was added, and this is what I told them to do last week. Did they achieve X, Y, and Z from what I told them from last week? And I'm listening out for those things that like have been corrected or things that I had just wanted to hear improvement on. I'll be listening for those and I'll give feedback based on what I said previously to what they presented within the lesson itself. And so that's what the lesson plan is and how I shape feedback and give assessment for that setting. Whereas in the classroom setting, I'm always planning that not all the students actually paid attention to the last class. And since it is more, you're not doing week to week, you're sometimes doing every other day, or you're working with the same group every single day, depending on the setting that you're in. My lessons are always scaffolded based off of what was previously taught, but also being sure that I also review what was taught before, either quickly or having to go more in depth, depending on the feedback of the student. And something that I actually heard, which was really interesting from one of our teachers, Dr. Bonviri, was the idea that like your lesson plan is great, but the only thing that's like a definite in your lesson plan in the classroom is the first thing you do. Because once you say the first instruction, anything can happen and you have to adjust to whatever happens in the classroom and you just have to roll with it until the end where you may do your closer and you may not do your closer activity. And it's just you just have to be prepared for anything that happens and you might not get to everything, which is a lot hard. It's a lot harder to do in the classroom to get through everything, whereas in a private lesson, you will probably, for the most part, get through a majority of what you want to learn, and there isn't that like that strict structure that you have to end on like a high note, or you have to end with like relaxing the class back down. For like we talk about in larger group settings is like energy and just scaling out energy throughout the classroom so that you may start kind of high and then plateau in the middle and then right when they're about to leave class, maybe slow down a little bit so that they're ready for the next class that they're going to, especially in the general music classroom.
Yeah, definitely.
But how about you, Michaela? What would you in like the lesson planning stages for private public?
Yeah, I think it seems to me like it probably would be easy to fall into a place of thinking with a private lesson that, oh, okay, well, I don't have to do too much planning. It's just me and this one person. Like, we're good. Um, but as Jason and I discussed before we started recording, and in a little bit of research that we've been doing, having real objectives and assessments set up is still very important in order to make sure that there is learning taking place. So I think in private lessons, I probably the type of planning I do would be different. I would plan differently. Uh, I think with a larger class, I feel that I need to have more activities planned, whereas with to keep them engaged, and with a private lesson, I think depending on my knowledge of the student and the rapport we might have, I could have less activities planned, but be ready to go more in depth into understanding them and into practicing them and things of that nature.
No, that's definitely something that you should be aware of is how you're planning those lessons depending on, and like Michaela had mentioned, maybe try not to fall into that hole of like a private lesson you don't have to plan because something that like especially from one of our readings that we did which was by Jennifer Labenthal. It'll be included in the link below. But it was a really interesting read talking about the assessment process and how in public school or public classrooms or large group classes, as a music educator, you go really in depth about assessment, how you're assessing students and how you plan that assessment and different ways to achieve assessment. Whereas it's not as much research in the private setting because the idea of assessment in the terms of seeing their scale and seeing their level based on the national standards that music educators follow don't always apply directly to the private lesson. But in the same sense, a private lesson can also be enhanced if you use some of those guidelines, like creating, performing, and responding. If you add those into your private lesson, those can be very very beneficial just to have your student learn more about music in a larger array than just the instrument that they're on or the music that they're learning directly. Um, so just that assessment process can work well in both settings, and a lot of things that both Michaela and I have been able to work on and experience within our pre-service classes. All those the planning, the relationship building, the skills and communication, and all those great things that we spent the past 4 years, maybe 5 years, trying to hone in on and get better at, and being able to be flexible. All those skills can translate really well into the private setting because the overall ideas are still the same. You're still communicating with a one-on-one student. You're still building that rapport, building that relationship, but you're also still trying to provide a form of music education that, though not like as direct as as the public setting, it is still like a direct focus. Like so and so wants to be better at piano, therefore, you have to prepare that. You have to prepare yourself to be I need to prepare X, Y, and Z before I can go into this lesson and expect to teach them how to play this thing on piano. First, I have to be able to understand it, which sometimes I will say past private teachers of mine just weren't prepared. They come in and just expect me to do everything and wouldn't demonstrate, which is when it gets kind of frustrating that you aren't getting that actual one-on-one thing. But there are also many private teachers who do demonstrate, and like that also just shows that they can balance that music education versus just doing it.
Yeah, it's kind of it's interesting to explore the difference between private teaching and private coaching, I suppose. While they can be used synonymously, I suppose there are some scenarios where they are a little bit different. Whether people differentiate the terms or not is another story, but it sounds like some of the experience you were talking about, Jason, would probably be more like coaching, like telling you what sounded good or what needs to change and then letting you figure the rest out. Whereas private teaching, I would imagine, is more about a back and forth and a real, well, teaching and not just giving feedback about what it sounds like and that type of thing. Really fully processing and facilitating learning to a deeper level.
Yeah, and that's like definitely like the yeah no that's a great analogy. Coaching versus teaching, and they of course like you said they are used synonymously sometimes as being the same thing. But a coach sometimes isn't able to tell you exactly how to fix something or tell you to try something new, whereas a teacher will give feedback that directly relates to what you did well and what you did, what needs improvement. And hopefully, your teacher will give you tips on how to improve it or what to change in order to improve it. And that's something just in general, like giving feedback and relating feedback back to the student themselves and also just around what you're learning. Um, but something that so we talk a lot about like it almost sounds like we're comparing the two as like a pro and con, like one is better than the other. But in reality, both settings, the private lesson setting and the large classroom setting, have their have their pros and have their cons, and it's more so just about how they can actually help out one another is what I'm trying to get across. Or I think also Michaela as well is like having a private lesson and also a group teaching can vastly improve a student's individual musicality and just boost their music education. And regardless of what setting that they're focused in, let's say if a school setting doesn't have a 'cause with funding and everything, sometimes students lose the ability to have education in the public setting or the school setting. Therefore, having the accessibility for a private lesson setting is another great way just to continue learning about music and getting music education, and vice versa. If you can't, if your family or some, or you don't want to pursue a private lesson, the public school setting and the large classroom setting also is another great way to facilitate music education, but in like a different realm. One's a bit more focused in exactly one thing, whereas another is kind of the broader, more ideas and more larger scope of what music education is.
Yeah, definitely. They bring very different pros, each of them.
Hmm.
The public education or just the group education, a larger class, brings again a different type of accountability of having people around you hearing you aside from your teacher and the little bit of pressure to want to do well in that regard, as well as being part of a larger ensemble, a larger group, a team, where you are responsible for the sound that everyone is producing. And that brings a different type of weight from a private lesson, which is a totally different type of pressure if you walk into your private lesson knowing you did not prepare. It doesn't feel good.
No,
um, and
it's
you come
not.
hide behind it. But yeah, it also brings different types of, again, like accountability, and also things like grades in a classroom might be a deterrent for some. It might be a real helpful way to motivate people to really work hard. But basically, both are valuable and can be sometimes supplemental to each other. One can supplement what's not being had in another.
Yeah, no, and that's a great point that one can help out the other. And I will say for most private lessons that I've had, I've always had the teaching itself and then assessment within that teaching, and also I would usually end the year or like there would be always be like a couple end goals, like performance goals within those lessons. Like for me, for my piano lessons, I always had it was some type of playing competition that I did at Temple many years ago, where there are different levels, and I had to perform in front of adjudicators who would, give me a grade on my playing of a piece at that level that I was at. And then at the end of the year, we would do a recital at a retirement home where we would play piano for the elderly, which was a lot of fun and definitely kind of like goal orientated that you had these performances to set up, which is really similar to in a classroom setting. Let's say you're preparing for a concert, you have your winter concert, your spring concert of some sort or like other like events throughout the year that you're preparing students for. And in the end, like that's like it's the same format. You're doing teaching for a goal and you're assessing that and then using that goal as an assessment area. And like Michaela said, with grades, because you're primarily not being graded like from like a F to A type of, range in the private lesson. I don't think I've ever had a teacher be like, you got an F on this today for your etude playing. It's less so of getting that grade and more so just like, oh, well, you didn't do that well on this etude. Let's work on this, this, and this, and then let's touch on it next week or something. Whereas sometimes in the classroom setting, especially in like general music courses, or sometimes you have playing exams and whatnot, you do have to give that numerical grade. And depending on the teacher, they use it as a direct source of like competency or as something to improve on. Because I know that I believe my band director in high school had it so that you could submit a grade for this assignment in, but you could always keep improving on that grade. Like let's say you said you got an 80 on this playing exam, but in a couple of weeks you practiced it, played it again using the feedback that was given. He would bump your grade up depending if you improved, because you're measuring improvement rather than like at the moment type of thing.
Redemption.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. Um, but I kind of want to just like, what are some like pros and cons that you see in both type of scenarios and how they can come together?
Sure. So I think basically the word of the day, accountability. There are both pros and cons on both sides of either a larger class setting or larger ensemble and private lessons. The accountability is different, so I kind of on the accountability scale, we're making a nickel every time we say accountability. It's it depends on what motivates a student. If they're motivated by the more social aspect or the relationship between their peers and themselves in that regard, then they might be more motivated in a classroom setting. Whereas if there's a student who is more motivated specifically by measurable growth of their own ability, they might have more success in private lessons. But again, they work so well together. Having the larger ensemble instruction where they kind of have a sense of where people at similar levels to them are and they could kind of grow and learn from the community around them can be so useful to motivate a student to want to grow themselves and understand more deeply what they're doing in private lessons, and private lessons build their musicianship and puts it back into the ensemble.
Yeah, and that's definitely like the relationship that they should have, where they both benefit one another. I will say from the private lesson, you definitely get more one-on-one instruction. You get a lot more attention to your individual skills, which can be brought back into the classroom. But I will say, for the most part, larger classrooms definitely have a more diverse range of musical offerings. Like in your high school ensembles, you have access to like, well, speaking from like a band or instrumental setting, you could have access to chamber groups, jazz bands, marching bands, concert bands, wind ensembles, which would not be possible with your just one-on-one setting. Like you can play a solo and learn etudes and stuff alone, but you in a private setting, especially for like a studio that is just you and the teacher and some other similar instruments, you probably aren't having that large community growth or like large ensemble playing that you can get from the classroom.
Yeah, and actually, before I forget, there was one more thing that I wanted to point out. In a one-on-one setting, I think that the learning being done is so much more intentional than the learning being done in a larger setting. Not to say that there is less learning in a larger setting, it's just that the learning that happens there sometimes is subconscious level learning that you don't even realize you're picking up on. And in a private lesson, there's way more that you have to specifically set out to do, which brings a different type of, I guess, energy level and necessary time to be putting in. So, again, having that balance is really important. And yeah, to me, basically, private lessons are to deepen individual understanding so that um, musicians can come together and have a better product and a more yeah, just a deeper understanding and a better ability to work with each other because they have their own individual understandings.
Yeah, no, and I completely agree with that. And I think something that's interesting that I actually was just thinking about is the idea of private lessons. I think are taking a shift in how they're being presented. Because when I was in high school, you'd only ever really take private lessons if like you wanted to pursue music. A lot of people that I knew in high school who took private lessons ended up pursuing music one way or another. And it wasn't always because they were taking lessons to improve themselves in the school ensemble. It was because they wanted to either pursue a field in music or get better on an instrument type of thing. Whereas the high school that I teach marching band for, a lot of their students have private lessons, but I've spoken to many of them, and sometimes they are just doing it because they just want to individually get better at playing so they can bring more to the table in terms of their ensembles. Like their jazz band is really big, and they love their jazz program there. Therefore, a lot of the trombone students take trombone lessons because they want to play better jazz music in jazz band, or the trumpet players. And even in the case of marching band, some of them are take lessons on trumpet because they want to get better at trumpet so they can play harder and more challenging or more exciting music within those settings. And that's just like a I think it's I'm sure that that goal has been around for a very long time where students want to pursue an activity with the lessons to improve themselves within that setting. But from at least my own experience, I never thought like I took lessons in high school on tuba because I wanted to get better at district band, which was an audition process type of thing. And then later on, of course, that helped me audition for school. But it wasn't so much so that like I myself wanted to improve individually because I wanted to like bring more to the table or learn harder music. Sure like that like coincided. Like the more I practiced, the easier it was to play different types of and
Right.
more challenging, more complex music. But that
It's a
wasn't my goal.
bonus.
Yeah, it was just an added bonus on the fact that I wanted to do it. But yeah, so I do think depending you as the teacher, how you communicate private lessons to your students and how you build that kind of like rapport with your students about the ideas of private lessons within the classroom or taking private lessons could be extremely helpful. And also private lessons also help classroom teachers little just in just terms of learning because as a music educator your primary instrument is usually a instrument family or like a single instrument or like maybe a small group of instruments, and you as a music educator you're expected to be able to understand all instruments and how to utilize the voice, how to function piano and whatnot and function strings, and be able to like start students off and fix issues that come up that are very common. But the private lesson setting, being able to maybe build relationships with private lesson teachers allows you to like teach in a way that you may have not thought before. There was a post I think one of my woodwind instructors on high school marching band stated about double reed players and how I'm not a double reed player and I could not tell you how to properly form an embouchure on a oboe or bassoon. But having those private lessons and being like, hey, if you want to play oboe or bassoon, sure, we can start out together, but you might want to think about getting private lessons so that you can have more success in the classroom with it. Just because, to be honest, I'm not super familiar with the instrument and I can only get you so far. Especially the students are really dedicated on those type of instruments, those harder instruments that you may not have, the teacher may not have the most experience teaching or interacting with. So that's another way that you can use private lessons to benefit your classroom and vice versa. But so that's gonna probably about like wrap up our discussion for today, just about like the ideas of private and public, well, private lessons and like the public or large group classroom, not so much like private schools. That's a whole nother topic. But and they like Michaela and I have both stated, they both have their pros and cons, and the interaction between the two and how they relate to one another is kind of the end goal, where you want to think about how one can benefit the other and what they're both bringing to the table, and not so much that one is better than than the other one. Both of them have their pros and cons that they bring to the table. But is there anything you want to talk more about, Michaela, on those subjects?
No, I mean, I think you pretty much covered all of it. Um, yeah, and as a music educator, that's the idea of teaching private lessons is something that is very, very common and something that if you are a music educator or a beginning music educator in training, whatever level you're at, uh, definitely something to consider and yeah, to keep in your at least in the back of your mind and how you would plan for it. And don't
Yeah.
close your mind to it. Good
No,
point.
that's super important. Forget sometimes that our podcast is called Lines and Spaces, and we talked a lot about the lines, which are the commonalities. But the space is about the idea that we're just talking about, or like the larger idea is how the two relate and how you, as the music educator, can use private lessons to benefit your classroom individually, or how you can think about using private lessons in a different scope than you might have thought before. And I'm going off of Michaela's point about like a lot of music educators having to also teach private lessons or also run private studios. It's also important to think that when you're in the process of becoming a music educator or in your pre-surface stage is offering lessons because they allow you to build communication and also it's another way to just to help you learn how to teach because one-on-one settings are great to experiment and try new things to see what can be successful in the larger classroom. So I currently teach. I taught tuba and euphonium students in the past, and I currently am teaching my two of my younger relatives piano, and I've taken piano lessons for many years, but I will not say that I'm like a phenomenal piano player. But I know how to function on piano, and I've played a lot of music on piano, and I know the basic techniques of it. But I'm currently also in the process of taking a class called Keyboard Harmony, where I had to teach lessons on piano, but to a larger group setting. And I'm kind of not like taking away from their private lesson, but sometimes I'll like try new things in their lessons to see if it works or not. And if it doesn't work, I'll go back to like try another thing. Or if it does work, then I can start thinking about, oh, well, it worked in this one-on-one setting. Maybe I can broaden it to a larger setting. Just thinking about how you can translate one to the other, or even taking something from the classroom or how you're saying instructions in the classroom into your private lesson setting because they aren't like entities of their own. They're in the same like column of what music education is, and there a lot of the terminology and a lot of the ways that you teach those type of settings are like interchangeable. Like they go hand in hand. But that will probably do it for us today here on Lines and Spaces. I want to thank you again to everybody who's been tuning in and listening. It's been great working with Michaela and just this whole idea of this podcast itself and like developing it and like thinking about what to talk about. So if you have any questions about um, maybe topics or introducing topics or wanting to like be a part of it or asking questions about music education or like pre-service music education and music education like teaching in the actual field and that stage of like student teaching, I know that Michaela and I are both in the final stages of getting into student teaching. I think we just got our placements for that this past week, which is super cool. And we're very excited to get started with those. We're almost there and we're almost at the end. And I just want to say something special for next week, our next podcast. We will have some special guests on our panel. So instead of just seeing the two of us, you'll see four people, including the two of us, so just two new people, which is still really exciting. Um, and we're gonna be talking more about the topics of like the our individual learning processes in music education, but also in different aspects of music and how we prepare in classrooms and how we prepare our teachings and also just the setting that we teach in. And also just since it is getting to that time where people audition for schools and apply for schools and whatnot, that we're gonna share some of our insight on the audition process for different schools, how to prepare and just like what we did to prepare to get us comfortable to audition and whatnot for anybody who is maybe a high schooler thinking about auditioning or thinking about applying to a music school or for a music major of any sort. So definitely check that out when that comes out. I think you froze, Michaela. Are you there? Well, with Zoom, these things do happen. I think our co-host Michaela is currently frozen in time. But yeah, again, thank you for tuning in and listening to us talk about public and private public teaching and large group teaching versus the private setting. And you're back. I had to riff for a second, but Michaela, are there any ending words you want to send
Uh,
off before we close?
God bless Wi Fi.
Yes. That's I think that's the first time that's happened while we were in the process of recording, which is cool. I mean, it was bound to happen eventually, so I'm just thankful that it happened towards the end, and not in the middle. But again, thank you for tuning in and listening to us talk about things music, education related. I'm Jason,
And I'm Michaela.
and we're signing off. We'll see you next time. Thank you.